Thank you for joining the U.S. Embassy in Islamabad this evening for our third and final webinar on the critical subject of combating trafficking in persons. My name is Aaron Tarver, and I am the Counselor for Public Affairs here at the U.S. Embassy. It is my pleasure to welcome you and introduce tonight's moderators. Human trafficking, as you know, is an appalling and pervasive crime. It is a global crisis that touches both Pakistan and the United States. By its nature, the crime of human trafficking is often hidden from view. Although the real numbers are hard to determine, an estimated 25 million people around the world are victims of human trafficking, including millions of women and children. Undoubtedly, this crime is an affront to human rights and human dignity. It also undermines national security, distorts markets, and enriches transnational criminals and terrorists. The U.S. Embassy takes a multi-pronged approach to combating trafficking in persons, including raising public awareness about this crisis, and connecting Pakistani law enforcement and members of the judiciary with counterparts in the United States who have experience and expertise in countering human trafficking. Through the speaker series, we aim to bring you the knowledge, experience, and best practices of these experts. Tonight, we are delighted to welcome two such experts, Judge Pamela Chen and Judge Taryn Merkl, who bring together more than 50 years of combined experience in the field. I know that this is going to be a great discussion. With that, I'm going to step back and I am pleased to introduce our moderator for the evening, Dr. Farhan Navid from the University of Punjab in Lahore. Dr. Navid is an associate professor of sociology and the director of the university's Center for Peace and Security Studies. He's authored 2 books and published several articles in internationally peer-reviewed journals on human trafficking. Before I turn it over to Dr. Farhan to introduce our 2 panelists, I'd like to extend my deepest gratitude to all of our participants, esteemed guest speakers, moderators, and organizing team. Thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy this program.
Thank you so much, Mr. Aaron. It's my pleasure to introduce our 2 panelists today who have a very diverse and rich experience in this field. Our first panelist is Judge Pamela Chen. She received her Bachelor of Arts degree from the University of Michigan and her Juris Doctor from Georgetown University Law Center. She started her career at the law firm of Horner and Porter from 1986 to 1989, and then at the criminal defense law firm of Asbill, Junkin, Myers, and Buffon from 1989 to 1991, both law firms located in Washington, D.C. From 1991 to 1998, she was a trial attorney in the Special Litigation Section of the Civil Rights Division at the United States Department of Justice. Beginning in 1998, she served as an Assistant United States Attorney in the Eastern District of New York, except for a 4-month period in 2008, when she served as Deputy Commissioner for Enforcement for the New York State Division of Human Rights. During her service in the United States Attorney's Office, she held many supervisory positions, including Chief of the Civil Rights Section and Deputy Chief of the Public Integrity Section. On August 2, 2012, President Barack Obama nominated Judge Chen to serve as a United States District Judge for the United States District Court for the Eastern District of New York. Our second panelist for today's session is Judge Taryn Merkl, who is a senior counsel in the New York University Brennan Center's Justice Program and its Law Enforcement Leaders to Reduce Crime and Incarceration initiative. Her work focuses on building a smarter, stronger, and fairer criminal justice system while reducing unnecessary incarceration and promoting public safety. Ms. Merkl previously served as an assistant U.S. attorney in the Eastern District of New York and served as deputy chief of the criminal division and as chief of the civil rights and organized crime and gangs section. In civil rights, she supervised all human trafficking and criminal civil rights cases in the district. Ms. Merkl also served as founding co-chair of the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force and has received various awards and honors from, among others, the U.S. Department of Justice, the Women in Federal Law Enforcement Foundation, and the New York Law Journal. Ms. Merkl has also designed and taught human trafficking trainings for the Department of Justice, among other federal agencies, and serves as a lecturer in law at Columbia University. I'm very thankful to our panelists for sparing some time out of their very busy schedule and sharing some of their experiences and expertise in this field with us in today's session. With this brief introduction, I would like our panelists to share their presentation.
Thank you so much, Doctor, and thank you for the warm welcome and for inviting us to your program. I'm going to share my screen to kick us off with a short presentation, and we do want to reserve plenty of time at the end for your questions. So Judge Chen and I will spend a little bit of time going through our prepared remarks and then hopefully have a lot of time for questions. So here we go. Hopefully this technology doesn't fail us. Everybody can see the PowerPoint. Somebody give me a thumbs up. Okay, I see a thumbs up. Thank you, Judge Chen. So I think that, Mr. Tarver sort of started us off in the right note. And when I think of combating trafficking, the first thing that is necessary is raising awareness. And here in the United States, we found that certainly to be a key first step. When our Trafficking Victims Protection Act was first passed in 2000, which Judge Chen is going to talk about in a little bit, we really needed a cultural change of mindset in identifying trafficking issues and identifying those who were being taken advantage of due to poverty, drug addiction, and other circumstances. So in terms of raising awareness, it's really critical to look at the typologies of trafficking and to understand where trafficking is residing within our own societies. Here in the United States, we have a project called the Polaris Project, and it runs a national anti-trafficking hotline. So if somebody sees something here in the United States relating to trafficking, they can say something by calling Polaris and advising Polaris of what they've seen. These tips that Polaris receives run the gamut from there's a guy who seems to be making a child play the piano on the subway. Got that tip once. Very imprecise, a tip law enforcement couldn't follow up on, but it gave the person who saw what they thought could be a trafficking situation the opportunity to call and see if law enforcement could check it out. In addition to providing an opportunity for members of the public to call, people who find themselves in a trafficking situation or need resource assistance can also call the Polaris hotline. And the Polaris hotline has sort of a regional breakdown where they send the tips out to different parts of the country. And by having this single kind of clearinghouse, they've also been able to issue reports about the types of trafficking that we see here in the United States and also other countries. The research that they conducted here in the United States analyzed over 30,000 cases and identified at least 25 different forms of human trafficking here in the United States alone. And they run the gamut. It covers different industries, different methodologies of control, and many of the types of trafficking that we see here in the United States, tragically, are seen worldwide. Just to give some examples, and many of these will sound familiar if you study this issue anywhere in the world: escort services, also known as prostitution, massage, residential work, domestic servitude, bars and strip clubs, pornography, restaurants, peddling and begging, personal sexual servitude, people who maintain somebody in their home or somewhere else to provide sexual services to them, hotels, construction, commercial cleaning, factories, carnivals and circuses, healthcare, and forced marriage. Those are just some of the many examples of the typologies of trafficking that have been identified here in the United States. And to combat the different forms of trafficking, it's really important to know what they are and where to look, and sort of how trafficking works. Some of the common methods of trafficking that we have seen here in the United States that really do seem to be worldwide include traditional pimping and prostitution, which is a form of sex trafficking that is seen everywhere in the world. And here in the United States, in the law enforcement community in particular, we think about pimping and prostitution work as falling into at least two categories. There are many other forms of control, though. One is what we colloquially call the guerrilla pimp, the sort of pimp who induces compliance in their victims by instilling fear and violence. And then you have your Romeo pimps, the ones who woo their potential victims and convince them that they love them, that they're going to have a life together. And if they just do this thing for a short period of time, they'll be able to make enough money that they both can live a nice life down the road. Both methods of control are invidious and dangerous and lead to long-term control over potential victims. Another form that we've seen in the United States is gang control. Local groups, loosely organized, sometimes more formally organized, sometimes international in scope. MS-13, the Bloods, the Crips. I don't know if those names mean anything to you, but in Pakistan, but some of those gangs are gangs that have been investigated for engaging in gang control, sex trafficking in our district. In addition, of course, you have traditional organized crime and emerging organized criminal groups, whether they be regional in scope or local and international syndicates, and then family control. And this form of trafficking can be very invidious when an aunt or an uncle convinces a young person to go into prostitution or some other industry for a period of time, and the person really feels that they have no choice because of their financial circumstances and the family's circumstances, and they're pressured into it. But these methods of trafficking and the industries in which they occur are the starting points for raising awareness and doing the difficult work that law enforcement and society have to identify these invidious forms of control and to put a stop to them. So here in the United States, we are still a work in progress. And Judge Chen is going to talk a little bit next about some of the work that was done on the ground here to raise awareness after the passage of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which was first passed here in the United States in 2000.
Thank you, Taryn. First of all, I do want to thank the State Department and the U.S. Embassy for inviting Judge Merkl and I to speak on a topic that we both feel very passionately about, both having worked in this area as prosecutors. And I also want to thank all of you for taking time out of your, what I'm sure are extremely busy days to come and listen to what we have to say. I also want to pause for a moment to congratulate all of you on Pakistan's cricket victory over India, which I know is a very celebrated event. And I wish I knew more about cricket so I can make an analogy about combating human trafficking and winning a cricket game. However, I only understand US baseball. So I will get back to the topic at hand. With respect to the United States and our evolution and understanding of the human trafficking problem and epidemic in our country, it's fairly recent, quite frankly. 1997, if you lived in New York, you would see deaf, mute people who seem to be of Latino origin or Latin American origin, walking around the subways in New York, peddling trinkets or little keychains or whistles or things like that, little toys. And they would hand you this little card you can see on the screen and says, "I am deaf," and ask for $1 in exchange for one of these trinkets. Well, it was discovered because two of these individuals who were doing this escaped their captors and went to the police. It was discovered that they were all being held essentially as slaves of other deaf, mute Mexicans who exploited them by bringing them to the United States with promises of legitimate jobs, but then basically holding them captive while they had to sell all these little trinkets on the subways. They were also forced to assemble them. And if they didn't keep up with a certain quota of sales or assembly, they were either beaten sometimes or tasered, so sort of electric shocked, to punish them for not keeping up with the amount of work and money they were supposed to earn and do. This really opened wide, I think, our awareness of the problem in the United States, because it was stunning to everybody that it was happening in plain sight, right under our noses. Millions of people every day rode the subways in New York City and saw these people being trafficked, but had no idea. So it was situations like this and the response of New York City, which was actually very admirable, because they found all of the individuals who were being held captive, put them up in hotels as a shelter, and then began investigating the case to prosecute it. Now, in those days, we didn't have a trafficking law, so we had to use the available laws that we had, and it was actually prosecuted out of Taryn's and my old office. Sorry, I should say Judge Merkl, but Judge Merkl's in my old office, and we work together a lot, so I feel I can call her Taryn, I guess. But it was prosecuted out of our office as an extortion case, meaning you threaten someone with physical violence or you use physical violence to get money out of them. But that was really the only law that our office thought could be used to prosecute this crime. So as a result of cases like this one, which was called Paoletti, that was a lead defendant, there was a movement to create a federal law. And so that prompted the Trafficking Victims Protection Act in 2000, just as Judge Merkl said. Next slide. So the TVPA, as we call it, of 2000, did some very radical things, at least in terms of US law enforcement. It has three key components that I think have contributed to its successful use all these years. So first, it criminalized a wide range of conduct not previously prosecutable federally. So like I said, when the Paoletti case arose, we didn't have the tools as prosecutors to prosecute them for exactly what they did, which was to enslave people through threats of harm and physical violence. And so now that kind of trafficking, labor trafficking and sex trafficking, became a separate crime with very serious penalties. So that was the other important aspect. The second part, and this, which is hard to imagine, but in US law, it's somewhat rare. And you actually now have a very similar law, which allows you to give, through the government, relief to victims in the form of immigration status and funding for services such as housing or mental health treatment or even job training. And this was a key, very visionary aspect of the law, because as many of you probably know from your own work, you can only build a case if you have a victim who's willing and able to participate in that process. And as you might have imagined, these individuals who've been so victimized and traumatized for so long were unable in some ways to actually participate. Further, we had the problem that, as I said before, they were deaf and mute. So imagine that. Communication in and of itself was so difficult. Moreover, what we learned, and I learned actually, is that there are many different forms of sign language. So down to the actual region. For example, you have American Sign Language, English, meaning British Sign Language, Spanish Sign Language, and then you have Mexican Sign Language. What further complicated this case was that these individuals who weren't formally educated barely even understood Mexican Sign Language. So you can imagine that this kind of funding and resource-intensive investigation is key to being able to bring these cases. But more importantly, we were able to provide services to the victims through actually sign language translators who could both house them and provide them services in order to make them able to participate in the prosecution. And then lastly, and you perhaps all know about this, is that the United States has decided to provide incentives to source countries, quite frankly, to prevent the flow of trafficking into the United States, because we are primarily a destination country rather than a source country for trafficking victims. And so you've probably heard of the TIP report that comes out every year. And it's the State Department's report where they rate countries on how they're doing on their anti-trafficking efforts. And so it's a 1-tier, 2-tier, and then below 2-tier rating. Once a country gets below the second tier, they run the risk of losing huge amounts of financial support from the United States. And as you might imagine, it motivates countries, especially places like Mexico, where obviously there's a steady flow of trafficking victims into the United States, to try to do better on preventing trafficking from happening. Now, with respect to the elements of sex trafficking, so as I said before, we have two primary trafficking crimes. One is labor trafficking and one is sex trafficking. So for sex trafficking, and I have to note, I looked at your trafficking law. Ours is a little bit more broken down into these different types of trafficking. And the main reason is because the penalties are much more severe for sex trafficking, which is also true, I noticed in your law, that there's a higher penalty. But the elements of sex trafficking were basically tailored to meet the nature of the crime, which can often be very hidden, as you might imagine. So knowingly recruiting, enticing, harboring, transporting, providing, or obtaining is the first element. So it really covers every way in which you might interact with a sex trafficking victim or traffic someone, a person for commercial sex acts. What's important about this feature is that commercial can really mean anything. It doesn't have to be limited to prostitution. So for example, if young girls are being forced to pose for photos that are then later, or engage in sex acts for photos or films that are later then monetized, that could be a form of sex trafficking. And then finally, the third not finally, but the next element is that knowing that force, fraud, or coercion will be used. That seems obvious. So someone's compelled to do it or tricked into it. And then there's coercion, which is a little softer. And I think that has helped us enforce this law. You have the same element in your law. And we have found that things like threatening to expose a young woman for having done something, for example, having engaged in prostitution, perhaps voluntarily at some point, could also be used as a means to get her labor as a sex worker, for example. And then finally, knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that the person is a minor. Now, as you can see, the last two are alternatives. And this is where I think our sex trafficking law has been tailored to meet the situations that we have in our country. We have a lot of underage prostitution of people, boys and girls, who are US citizens, so aren't coming in from another country, for example, and may not in some sense be forced into it in the traditional sense. We have a culture, unfortunately, in the United States of the pimp daddy. Maybe some of you have heard about this, and it's glamorized through pop culture. And some young girls and some young boys will get into what they call the life because they think they want to do this. But if they're minors, the trafficker will be prosecuted for this crime if they know or if they recklessly disregard the fact that the person is a minor. And so, like I said, our law is meant to address the problem that we have. And then a further tweak on this, if you will, or refinement is that reckless disregard now can extend to a situation where a trafficker has merely a reasonable opportunity to observe the victim. So in a sense, it puts the burden on the trafficker to actually pay attention to whether or not they're trafficking someone or asking someone to work in for commercial sex or do some kind of commercial sex act to make sure that that person isn't a minor. And it's been used quite effectively in a case that our office did and that I partially handled and somebody else took to trial, which was quite a tricky case. The one thing I'll say about this phenomenon in the United States, and this may not be relevant in some ways in Pakistan, but as I said before, we do have a slightly different culture where some young people, minors, do actually think they want to get into the prostitution business and they think it's voluntary, but under our law, it is not. It's effectively a strict liability standard. Forced labor, the elements are much simpler and very similar to yours. Knowingly providing or obtaining labor or services of a person through force, threats, physical restraint, or abusive legal process. The last one is perhaps worth explaining a bit. What we have often, because many of the forced labor victims are people from another country. So the typical form of abuse of legal process is threatening to expose someone to immigration authorities and have them deported if they don't comply and do the work that's being demanded of them. So those are the basic elements of our law. You're on mute, Tanner.
With the development of that law and efforts that occurred on many different levels to raise awareness, what Judge Chen and I really have observed since the passage of the Trafficking Victim Protection Act is a true paradigm shift. And that shift really was required on many levels, changing the way law enforcement thought about certain classes of persons, changing the way society thought about certain classes of persons. For example, Judge Chen gave the example of a young person who thinks they might perhaps want to, engage in prostitution. Under the conception we now have, it is not, there's no such thing as consenting to prostitute if you are under 18 in the United States. Whereas in the past, people might have, turned a blind eye to it thinking, oh, well, she's asking for it or she wanted it. But that, is no longer the law. And this, because of that change, has really caused a paradigm shift. And, Judge Chen and I have worked with law enforcement of varying types, from, state police through city police, through federal law enforcement, through international law enforcement officials with whom we've collaborated. And seen that it takes time for some, groups to really truly internalize and get that the power dynamics at play in certain relationships and the lack of control that some people have in our society due to financial circumstances, age, poverty, educational level, perhaps being deaf and mute. All of those factors play in to risk factors for trafficking and are part of raising awareness. And here in the United States, for example, we've seen a big shift in thinking away from the idea, for example, that somebody is just an illegal immigrant and a prostitute. Perhaps they're actually a trafficking victim. Perhaps they were brought to this country by an organized group and are being required to work in prostitution. So rather than being prosecuted for being a person who entered the country illegally, law enforcement is being asked to peel back the onion, if you will, and look a little bit deeper into the situation to figure out why is this person here? How did they get here? And are they actually acting voluntarily and of their own free will? Another example of the change in thinking, and I noticed that your law does this as well, the victim's involvement in criminal activity does not determine his or her status. So if somebody does something illegal through the course of their trafficking, that doesn't mean that they cannot get any relief or services or funding. And it also doesn't mean that they should be prosecuted. If somebody's being forced to traffic drugs or forced to engage in illegal sex work, that doesn't mean that they're going to be prosecuted for it if the circumstances show that their activities that are otherwise illegal are not because of their being done with their own consent. They're being under duress or perhaps being forced with threats of violence. So whether or not they're involved in criminal activity is not the end of the inquiry. Again, law enforcement is tasked with trying to figure out the facts and circumstances to determine whether this is a victim situation or survivor situation, as I like to say, or a situation where somebody's voluntarily engaging in crime. Judge Chen already touched upon the notion that our Trafficking Victim Protection Act expands the concept of coercion, as does yours. Psychological pressure is one of the things I thought was interesting in your trafficking victims, your trafficking law, that is sort of encompassed within our concept of coercion. Blackmail, psychological pressure, doesn't have to just be threats of violence. We now have a greater understanding of how people are able to control one another, and that expanded concept of coercion and the power dynamics at play certainly have added to the paradigm shift. In addition, the Trafficking Victim Protection Act in our country requires restitution and forfeiture. And the goal there, if there are resources available that the defendant is required to pay in a criminal case, is to help make the survivor more whole, to provide some recompense for monies that were taken that might have been earned, or to provide support for any psychological treatment and physical injury that requires medical treatment for which the perpetrator may be responsible. Our TVPA requires restitution and forfeiture at sentencing so that there is some hope at recovering financially for survivors of trafficking as well. We already touched upon the fact that our TVPA provides victims with legal status and the access to benefits, and that is critical in stabilizing victims sufficiently so that they can participate in the prosecution and help to actually bring a case across the finish line with law enforcement's support. And the other thing that's happened that I think is critical is the incorporation of victim advocates and service providers, oftentimes who don't work for the government, into the law enforcement process. And this is really revolutionary. In the United States, law enforcement thinks of themselves as doing their job, and they are operating with secret information oftentimes, and don't often interact with people who work for non-governmental organizations. But it's sort of cheesy to say in the United States, I don't know if this translates. I truly believe that tackling the challenges of human trafficking takes a village. I don't know if that's a phrase that translates, but takes a village here. We need social services agencies within the government. We need non-governmental organizations. We need shelters that provide stabilization services and places for survivors to live. There's this fabulous group of nuns near where we work that runs a shelter. They often take in women and girls from Spanish-speaking countries, and they help to stabilize them and provide them with education and English language classes and things like that while they transition from trafficking victim to productive member of society, hopefully. And without all of those people, law enforcement couldn't go it alone. There's no way as a federal prosecutor or as a police officer that we have the resources available to us to provide the victims with the sort of stabilization and support that they need in order to bring these very challenging cases over the finish line. So the other thing that has developed in this country, and I strongly advocate for it if it's something that is an option in other countries, is the task force approach. And the DOJ taking to bear all of these ideas of the need to bring this village into the picture to combat trafficking. The Department of Justice started a program that encourages the development of collaborative human trafficking task forces. And rather than being a strictly law enforcement focused task force where you have, like multiple law enforcement agencies working with the prosecutor's office, it's a multidisciplinary approach and it's multi-jurisdictional. So it covers a region, not one specific district or office of a prosecutor. And it also brings different disciplines to bear. Who are the social workers who are going to help provide support services? Who are the rape crisis counselors who are going to work with these young people who need to get through the sexual trauma and other things that they have survived? And it's collaborative and non-hierarchical, which is also totally at odds with how law enforcement usually operates, right? Law enforcement usually is sort of a paramilitary type structure with a commanding officer, and then there's captains and sergeants and police officers. The task force approach that I participated in as a founding member of the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force really was collaborative and non-hierarchical. Everybody would come to the meetings. Everybody had an opportunity to speak. People would share tips with law enforcement, and the service agencies and providers of service would discuss their challenges and how law enforcement and the government could support them better. And it was a collaborative effort to identify where there were gaps in the provision of services for victims, so that when victims and survivors were removed from the situation, how they can move forward as individuals, and also how law enforcement can move the ball forward in terms of dismantling the networks responsible for the trafficking and bringing the traffickers to justice. Just by way of example of how these task forces work, in the task force that I formed here in Brooklyn, and another task force that I helped to stand up we have two offices in my old prosecutor's office. In our other office, we had included the United States Attorney's Office, so the federal prosecutor level, the local prosecutor's offices, so the county level, or maybe in your country, the provincial level. We also included the state prosecutors, which in our country would be like New York State, and then we'd also have Brooklyn or Queens as the local prosecutors, and federal law enforcement, such as at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Labor, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, state law enforcement, so police and first responders. In addition, the victim service providers and advocates that I already mentioned, many of whom work for non-governmental organizations, but many of whom receive grants that are funded through the federal government and its anti-trafficking efforts. And these service providers and organizations are critical in bringing trafficking cases over the finish line because they help to build trust with survivors who have every reason in many cases to distrust the government. Many of the survivors with whom we've worked have had very negative experiences with the police, with Homeland Security, with Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and to overcome those prior bad experiences and help the person to understand this is not the same thing as what you experienced at the border. We are here to listen, no judgment, and we are here to figure out what happened and whether or not the people who did this to you can be brought to justice. It's a very different conversation when you have a trusted advocate, somebody that they've already perhaps spoken to in their native language and are already beginning to trust, sitting at the table with you saying, I know this person, she's good with her word, she's going to be able to help you if somebody can be prosecuted in this situation. In addition, we included the state and local agencies that provide social services. So, any state agency that was relevant that could have provided services was involved. People who, work on getting benefits so that people can buy food at the grocery store. People who work on benefits so that people can get a cheaper government subsidized housing. All of those organizations were included. And by building up this village, we were able to help stabilize victims and build more effective cases because these cases, as Judge Chen already mentioned, are challenging. You have people who are often very severely victimized, sometimes so traumatized it's difficult to even articulate what happened to them, and to develop the trust necessary to get enough information to investigate further, to corroborate their stories and to corroborate what happened to them. It's a lot of investigative work. And so building this sort of group up and helping stabilize victims was really, really critical to our office's success at identifying and dismantling some of the organizations that were bringing people to our district and to the New York City area for purposes of human trafficking. They are also on Twitter, the Brooklyn Human Trafficking Task Force. I don't know how much they tweet these days, but that is the Twitter handle of the task force that I used to lead. So very briefly, we also thought it might be useful to talk about sort of all of these, how these challenges play out in the life of a case, because it helps to crystallize why it matters to bring all of these different parties to bear. Criminal cases are complicated. You start out with an initial lead, and then you try to follow up with investigative steps. You might hear that there's a person being subjected to forced prostitution in a certain part of our city. How do you begin to investigate that? You might want to do surveillance. You might want to send the officers out to sort of see what's happening. And if you're able to develop enough victims and enough evidence, you have to file charges. And before filing charges, you have to be sure that there's enough evidence and that the survivors of the situation are actually willing to see the case through. Then there's a period of discovery where information is shared to the defendant. And during that phase of the case, the identities of people who are providing information to the government may start to be suspected, if not known for sure. So there are challenges with keeping your victims and witnesses safe and secure. There may be motion practice, which prolongs the case. And this whole time, you're trying to keep the survivors stable and safe and confident in the process, even while their stories are being attacked in court through motion papers and they're being called liars and other things. Try to keep our survivors away from knowing what's happening in court. But it is inevitable sometimes that some of it becomes known to them, depending on whether the case is high profile and covered by the media. Then you have a trial or the guilty plea. And the trial process itself can be a source of renewed trauma for survivors. Just the preparation for trial or a hearing related to an upcoming motion or trial can be a source of trauma for somebody who's been through a lot. So you have to really work closely with the non-governmental service providers and the psychologists, social workers, whoever's working with the victims to make sure that survivors are stabilized throughout this whole process for cases to succeed. And hopefully, ultimately, the case will get to sentencing. And sentencing really can be a remarkable moment for survivors. It can be a remarkable moment of closure where survivors finally have the chance to say in open court what they want the judge to hear. And I've had many survivors tell me that being able to speak at sentencing was what finally let them close the chapter and move forward with their lives. And as I mentioned before, there is a possibility that restitution can be available. Sometimes there's no funds, depending on the trafficker situation. But if restitution is ordered and funds are available, that too can help the victims to sort of turn the page and start a new chapter and provide them with stabilization and closure. And all of these things I've mentioned sort of tie back to the investigative challenges that these cases present. You have survivors and victims who are very fearful. They have oftentimes significant histories of trauma, drug or alcohol abuse, memory problems. The brain on trauma is worth study. If you are going to do trafficking work, memory problems are very, very common for people who have suffered severe trauma. Memories are stored differently when memories are caused through a traumatic incident. Sometimes they're not stored linearly. So it's very challenging sometimes to get trauma victims to tell a story in a way that other people can understand. I had one victim who I worked with a lot in preparation for trial, who could tell me every episode of things that happened to her, but she couldn't tell me what order, which created a really interesting challenge. But I was able to corroborate a lot of what happened to her through other survivors who were in the network. So I was able to prove up her story, but it was really challenging when I first sat down to debrief her, because her memories were such a jumble. And over the course of working with her, I began to realize it wasn't that she wasn't telling the truth, it was that she couldn't order the memories in a manner that people who haven't suffered trauma ordinarily could. Immigration status in our country can be a significant challenge for survivors and victims. Some victims are fearful to come forward because they're worried that they could face deportation or other things. Thankfully, we do have the Victim Services T visa, this trafficking visa that is available for survivors. And that something that Judge Chen and I, when we were both working as prosecutors, tried to ensure we supported victims in getting their T visa applications submitted so that they could receive that additional source of stabilization. Sometimes survivors and victims have criminal exposure, as I mentioned before, which can cause fear. So working through all of those challenges, developing survivors who are able and willing to testify in court is a huge, huge challenge, and one that, you know, has to be considered from all angles and really considered from the point of view of the survivor in order to meet the survivor where they are and move the case forward. The key to building a successful case is, of course, corroboration, trying to figure out, what can I prove any piece of what these survivors are saying? Do the survivors corroborate each other? Did they see each other being trafficked? And through that corroboration is what brings cases over across the finish line from a very sad story and a difficult situation for this survivor, and a case that can be brought to court oftentimes, because one victim trafficking cases are very, very difficult to prove. So, you know, we always sought to find additional corroboration in the form of other victims, you know, or just wire transfers proving, this was common in our cases involving Mexico, wire transfers proving that somebody was in this country and working and sending money back to the trafficking organization. That sort of corroboration really changes the game in terms of what's prosecutable in court. Agency resources can be a challenge because of all of the stabilization needs and the challenges of getting the survivors stabilized. And the collaboration with all the different stakeholders can also create challenges, which is why it's really helpful to have pre-existing relationships in the form of a task force or working relationships with non-governmental organizations, so that when you want to call the very vulnerable survivor to the stand, you don't have their own lawyer saying no, or their own NGO representative saying no. You want to make sure that you're working on those relationships throughout the whole case in order to ensure that the case can be brought to court. International courting can also pose challenges for those cases that have it. And we have had a lot of success collaborating with our counterparts in Mexico. And I've also coordinated with our counterparts in other countries, but with the large flow of victims that Judge Chen mentioned coming from Mexico, a big amount of the international coordination that Judge Chen and I personally have done was with the Mexican authorities. Is there anything you want to add, Judge Chen, before we get on to a couple examples of cases and audience questions? You're on mute.
Yes, like everybody else, I make that mistake often. No, let's go to the case examples, because we just want to briefly touch on these because they really exemplify everything that Judge Merkl just talked about with respect to the challenges we faced and continue to face in prosecuting these cases. I'm no longer doing that, but the office, and probably the same ones that you might encounter. And these cases, if nothing else, will tell you that we've all been down the same road, perhaps as you're facing right now. And the success of any prosecution, I think, is part luck, perseverance, and perhaps knowing what you should be doing. So the Credo case, prototypical sex trafficking case. It was our first human trafficking case. We knew nothing at all about how to proceed in these cases, but we learned the hard way about what to do and what not to do and how to improve our system and to use what Judge Merkl has been describing as this holistic village approach, where we brought in the victim advocates or the survivor advocates to help us in future cases. The way this case came about was that we got a lead, a tip from a mother of one of the victims, as it turns out, and she called the immigration office, ICE, our immigration office in Mexico City, and she basically reported that her daughter had been kidnapped by, it turns out, this gentleman, Jose Corretto, who's depicted here. That lead got sent up to New York. We did the investigative steps, but what was our first major step in the investigation? We ended up arresting all of our victims and charging them with illegal immigration, entering the United States illegally, along with all the traffickers who were their husbands or boyfriends. And so we approached it all wrong because we just didn't know what we were dealing with, because, as you might imagine, when the ICE agents went in and raided this house where the victims were living with their husbands or boyfriends, the women wouldn't talk to us. They didn't come running to us and say, we're victims, please help us, because they're from Mexico. They've been traumatized by these men. They've been caused to fear law enforcement because, sadly, a lot of law enforcement is corrupt in other parts of the world, including Mexico. So they didn't trust law enforcement. They didn't speak any English at all. They had no idea where they were. Moreover, the way these men trafficked these women in part and had leverage over them was that they had children with these young women. So the women had children who were being held essentially as captives by the trafficker's family. And we discovered later that there was a whole compound where a lot of the traffickers' children lived with the mother of some of these gentlemen. So there were all these things working against us, and we had no idea. Furthermore, we later learned that the men, when we were arresting all of them, turned to the women and did this, essentially saying, keep quiet or you're dead, or your children are dead. So what we learned was and we did weeks of interviewing just the women with culturally sensitive interpretation. We had a fabulous interpreter from Mexico who translated for us and who could sort of get into the heads a little bit and the mind space of some of these women, because she grew up herself in Mexico and was explaining to us some of the things that I think are hard to understand just based on the words that are being communicated alone. We managed to break through, we prosecuted the case, we corroborated it, just like Judge Merkl said, with finding some of these houses where these women were forced to work in prostitution. And we discovered a whole system. And I think once you start building on these cases, you discover that there are networks of different kinds of trafficking going on in plain sight, again, as I said before, but yet hidden. And so the way it works in New York is that the women are driven from house to house where there's a customer or a client. It's considered home delivery, akin to a pizza delivery. I hate to make that analogy, but there were little cards being handed out, not the ones we showed you before, but these ones said home delivery in Spanish, a tu casa, and then it would show a very scantily or half-naked woman. And this became the way that they conducted their secret prostitution business. And so the result was a good one, in the sense that the defendants, the two lead ones, were prosecuted, they pled guilty, they got sentenced to 50 years in prison. All of the victims were eventually, of course, let out of jail, provided services by non-governmental organizations, and really thrived. So much so, and I'll tell this sort of happy ending, is that as a judge, I've actually presided over the wedding of one of our former survivors who found love again, or found love perhaps for the first time, and married somebody else in the United States. So the amazing thing about all of you working in this area is that you really can save a life, if you will. And I don't mean to over dramatize it, but you can certainly restore one and restore someone's hope and ability to live a happy life. And so it's very compelling work. I think that's why Judge Merkl and I feel so strongly about it. The victims were literally transformed and have all been able to live in the United States and get all the services that they need from the government. So that's just one example. But what we learned from that is we have to work with the non-governmental victim support organizations in the beginning to identify the victims. And that's what we started doing more. We got more sophisticated about mining phone data. So for example, we started identifying where some of these women were being kept by getting a phone number and then using location investigation to figure out where the phones were and getting all sorts of search warrants and things like that. But also victims will come into some of these victim service agencies much more readily than ICE. And that's how we've been much more successful thereafter. We were much more successful thereafter. Taryn, go ahead with Rivera.
Sorry, just got a little cough. Judge Chen, what year was the Corretto case?
Sorry, 2003. So it was about 3 years after our TVPA was passed. I meant to say that.
And that's an important point, because I just think it's, you know, it's a great story because it turned out okay in the end, but it definitely was a learning curve for our office and for law enforcement. Another just really quick example, and then I know we want to get to your questions. There are many in the Q&A, so thank you all for that. Just as another example of a different sort of type of trafficking was a case that I did more recently involving a local sort of United States-based gang with domestic victims. And this case was a case where members of a sort of a street gang were involved in sex trafficking, drug trafficking, and other crimes, and that extended to forced prostitution. And two of the defendants, Michael Garrett and Paul Rivera, were convicted after trial of crimes that required mandatory life in prison. And I just include this sort of picture because this is one of the methods of control that Paul Rivera, the defendant here, would use on his victims. He would tag them. He was a tattoo artist, and he would literally brand the victims with his name in some instances, and also with the symbol of their gang. And those victims, you know, once branded, once included into this gang, were very reluctant to share information about it. And even though some of the things that happened to them were just horrific, unspeakable violence and terrible situations as to some of the victims, they really were reluctant to share it because they loved him, even though he was horribly violent. He was a classic sort of Romeo pimp. He could convince anybody to do what he wanted. He was one of those people. Many of the witnesses in the case described him as Svengali-like. He could just convince anybody to do anything. Very charming individual, very smart. But through developing those personal relationships, he convinced these young girls, some as young as 14, to be engaged in prostitution here in New York City. And they took, of course, all of the money. They also required the girls to courier drugs and do other things. But that case is just a different type of investigation and the kind of case that I'm certain occurs in other parts of the country and other countries as well. And the very last case example we have is a forced labor case, but I know we are very short on time. This was a forced labor case involving domestic workers who were basically held at a mansion and required to work as maids. And it's a fascinating case study, but I have gotten a message from our moderator that we are running short on time. So I do want to turn it back to the doctor for his questions and your questions.
Thank you so much, Judge Merkl and Judge Chen, for such a wonderful and informative presentation. I would just like to remind our attendees that you can ask questions from our panelists Please type in your question using the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Finally, at the end of the session, we request you to stay on just for a few moments for a very short poll. Okay, so I would like to start this question and answer session. What do you think, like over the years, different national reports have been indicating that every year increasing number of victims of trafficking are identified. But when we talk about number of prosecution or conviction, so that number has not increased significantly. So in your view, what are the reasons that we have not been able to increase the number of prosecutions or convictions?
So I think that one of the challenges of increasing the numbers are the investigative challenges that I mentioned before. As countries raise awareness regarding trafficking of persons and the types of industries affected by trafficking in persons, I think we are seeing more and more cases reported and identified, but many countries, including our own, lack sufficient resources to bring all of these cases to criminal prosecution. And to truly take a bite out of the trafficking problem, we need societal transformation. It's not just as simple as prosecuting our way out of this problem. We need to have better social services. We need better mechanisms to get people removed from trafficking situations and supported, because not every case can be brought criminally. Here in the United States and in Pakistan, we have an adversarial system of justice. There are going to be defense attorneys arguing that the survivors are liars and that the government's case is insufficient and is not appropriate to put somebody in prison. And so to bring a case, you need a lot of evidence when the standard of proof is as high as it is. So I think that, we can't only look to law enforcement to solve this problem. We need to look to industry, we need to look to local governments, and we need to increase awareness across the board so that people are not taken advantage of in this way. Because as long as there is poverty and drug addiction, I believe there will be trafficking.
Professor, can I sort of weave in one of the questions asked by the audience members, which is a great one, how the issue of TIP can be addressed in an environment of poorly drafted TIP law, lack of adequate human and financial resources, weak investigation and prosecution, lack of coordination between federal and provincial institutions, and no monitoring mechanisms in place. And this came from one of the audience members.
Yes.
I think that really does summarize all of the challenges we've been talking about, and each one is quite daunting. The one thing I will say, though, is having reviewed the TIP law that has been drafted, and both the criminal part of it as well as the very extensive legislation about providing victim services and identification and giving status, et cetera. I think you have those tools. You do have the prosecutorial tools. It seems to me you have a law that supports providing those necessary services and other components of an effective anti-trafficking program. The question is, where do the resources come from to actually bring the cases or to provide the services that the law guarantees? And I think that's a question that I suspect neither Judge Merkl or I can answer, I guess, because we don't know how things are on the ground in Pakistan. But to me, it seems like you had the same problem we did before, which is we had a law that was robust and provided all the tools we need and authorized us to get certain services. We just had to implement it. And for us, it came through the Department of Justice as a central prosecutorial authority. But they also had to work, just as Judge Merkl said, with all these different agencies in the government. And it seems to me Pakistan has to sort of get those groups to the table together, whether locally, nationally. It seems to me it has to flow nationally down to organize this, because trafficking is such a fluid situation, and the resources have to come, I think, from the national level, I suspect.
Judge Merkl, would you like to add anything?
No, I agree with Judge Chen. There's multifaceted challenges, but your law is good. The 2018 law that I reviewed, I think it covers a lot of situations. It's a question of bringing all of the relevant resources to bear and figuring out a strategy for determining which cases are prosecutable.
I would like to urge those in the audience to think about, could you form a task force? I noticed that Usman Noorani said a task force is a very good initiative. And the question is, can you think about it? Because we started in a somewhat stumbling fashion ourselves. I mean, our task force, because it was before Judge Merkl took over. So we basically were in a relay race together. I handed the baton off to her, but in the beginning, we made a lot of mistakes, right? But we put together kind of a DIY, as they say, do it yourself kind of initiative locally between our prosecutor office. So we're a federal office, but we operate locally, with the one across the river, which is Manhattan. So we pulled together because of a very forward-thinking prosecutor over there. She started it, we joined, we pulled in our local partners. And you have to just start somewhere, I think, rather than waiting maybe for the higher ups to come and put it together for you. That's what I suggest. Even if you know people, because personal relationships are a great way to build these task forces. And the other thing that cannot be emphasized enough is what Judge Merkl said. In order to be successful in anti-trafficking, you do have to change the mindset of most law enforcement. And we're being candid about it. As prosecutors, we go to law school, and I think we have a slightly different perspective, a somewhat dispassionate view about enforcing the law. But law enforcement does tend to view the world, I think, a little more black and white than we do, because we have to interpret the laws. And so we spend a lot of time, both Judge Merkl and I, working with agents constantly, because there's constant turnover, to say, no, people who are in prostitution, working in prostitution, or even being drug runners aren't necessarily criminals. And in fact, even if they violated a criminal law, they can still be victims. A couple of other innovative things to think about is we have in New York a very innovative local court system, because the question is, what can the courts do? Where it's nominally a court where prostitution workers are brought in to be prosecuted for sex work, but the purpose of the court is to use social service advocates to interview them to determine if they're actually trafficking victims. And it seems like a very simple idea, but it took a long time to bring about. And so this judge who sits on that court basically views it as half dealing with people who are committing crimes, perhaps voluntarily as adults, and the rest who are trafficking victims being forced into this. So things like that, I think, are quite innovative. But again, and I know I'm sort of sounding like I can't even think of the word now. Just beating the expression's not a good one, beating a dead horse. But you really do have to work with your service providers. So today, if you do nothing else, try to figure out who's in your area that provides services to victims and reach out to them to try to put together a task force, even just talking to them. But we used to bring them into the interviews with our law enforcement. Very controversial proposition, but that's how we became much more successful. Because two things as a prosecutor, why it mattered is they could talk confidentially, if they're lawyers, with the victims. And I noticed your law provides for victims to get all these services. And it would be privileged. So if the victim lies the first time, which happens a lot, that lawyer can talk to them confidentially and they don't have to tell us, but then the lawyer can try to convince before we meet with the person to tell the truth. And that's one thing. And the second thing is it makes the victim feel supported, because you do have to meet the victim where they are. They've been traumatized, many for years. They do not trust anyone, rightfully so. And they're suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder or all sorts of things. So I think some of these smaller measures that you can do by yourself without waiting for the bigger authorities to help you, I think can get you further along in using your very good laws. I'm sorry for taking over.
No. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much, Chen. And I totally agree with you that this idea of task force is very convincing one. I'm just wondering, like when you talk about this task force, so do you have like a specific composition of this task force that should be across the districts, or every district has its own composition of task force? So would you please like to educate us about it?
So here in the New York region, we had a couple of different task forces over time. One was the one that Judge Chen described, which was sort of a ragtag startup, which was basically everyone who cared about this issue would just show up at this big conference room in our city hall in the main city government building. And there was often not even really an agenda. We would talk about current challenges. We would talk about, what's going on in this case. A service provider would say, I'm having this problem. A governmental agency would say, we're having that problem. And we would just sort of talk it out. But what started to happen was relationships were built. And so, I would know that once a month I'd get to see the deputy inspector for human trafficking for the NYPD. So even if I didn't have like a legit reason to call him, I would have this opportunity to talk to him every month, just for a few minutes. Like, got anything for me? Got anything federal? And so we would. It's network building, and in addition, the service providers, many of whom receive grants from the government in our country, had this opportunity to provide, they're just what they were happy about what the government was doing and what they were unhappy about with regard to what the government was doing. And so this was a very informative phase. And then the Department of Justice sort of formalized the opportunity for local areas to develop a sort of regional task forces. And those regional task forces usually are a given federal district, which can be as big as an entire state, in the United States, to certain districts which are smaller, but those districts would work with all of the local law enforcement and all of the local agencies and the non-governmental organizations. And the incentive that the Department of Justice was able to provide for these collaborative task forces to get off the ground was some funding. I mean, so the NGO, the non-governmental organization that was our one of the founding partners of our task force here in Brooklyn, they got a government grant. In addition, the state prosecutor's office got a small grant from the government to aid in their enforcement efforts. And they were able to hire, one staff member to help run the task force. And they were able to upgrade some equipment for searching phones. Not a huge grant, right? But enough for them to be committed to the cause. And so, exactly who needs to be on the task force is going to vary depending on who the local resources are, what service providers exist. Are your services more provided by governmental entities, or are they more provided by non-governmental entities? I happen to have on my desk a mug, which you probably can't see because of the blur, from the governmental entity in Mexico that runs a big shelter for victim services and I just happen to have it on my desk. I drink coffee out of it. And this in Mexico, FEVIMTRA, the organization that helps survivors in Mexico, they run their own shelter. It's a different model than what the United States has. We don't have that. We don't have our own governmentally run shelter for victims of human trafficking. That's a choice that they'd made in Mexico. And so there's no perfect way to do it. And, it just really depends on who's in your region or the part of the country that you work in, who is available and able to start building up that network. Because really, I see that network as a huge key to those cases we were able to prosecute successfully. And even in a case where we couldn't prosecute it successfully, we had ways to get services provided to victims, even if we couldn't make a criminal case. So I have many people who I've spoken to over the years who I couldn't build a whole case from, but that didn't stop me from hooking them up with a non-governmental organization for services, making sure that they had a bed to sleep in, making sure that, if and when they were going to apply for their T visa application, I would sign the requisite law enforcement paperwork for that. So it's just building up those networks whoever's available. I mean, seriously, it's like all hands on deck, whoever's available.
Can I add, I agree with everything Judge Merkl just said, because it really has to be tailor fit to your situation. But it seems to me, and tell me if you disagree, Taryn, that the core, though, constituents of such a task force should be a prosecuting authority, whether national or local. And I would suggest, if you can, get a federal and a local law enforcement agency involved, depending on who the prosecutor is. If it's purely local, that's fine too. A local prosecutor, local law enforcement, and then a service provider. Those are the three, I think, irreducible minimum you need, because you need the persons who are going to encounter the victim first and identify them. So those will be the local law enforcement and the service provider, and then the prosecuting authority. So minimum, I would say those three, and beyond that, it's whatever you need, just as Judge Merkl said. There are a couple.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah. There are a couple of questions in the queue, I think, that Judge Merkl and I should answer because they're posed by judges. One has to do with a judge who wants to know about the procedure to adjudicate the case, and another attendee who wants to know about the main challenges encountered by the judicial system. I'll take a crack at this, and then Judge Merkl can certainly improve on it. I would say that the procedure in adjudicating a trafficking case is not different from the judge's point of view than almost any other case. There may be some issues about confidentiality with respect to the victim's name. So oftentimes you might want to use a pseudonym or initials. But beyond that, the procedures that we use for all criminal law basically apply the same to a trafficking case. But Judge Merkl could answer this better because she recently tried a very extensive trafficking case when she was a prosecutor still, before she became a judge. And then the main challenges for the judicial system, like I said, I think we're sort of the last agency or body to deal with the issue, other than, like I said, if you can be innovative by having local courts that may be likely to encounter potential trafficking victims who are misidentified as perpetrators or criminals. But otherwise, the more important steps in this process is to have the investigators and the prosecutors work with the local NGOs or whoever they need to identify victims and bring cases. But the one thing I will say is educating judges about what a trafficking victim looks like could be very important, because we've had judges in our court who mistakenly think and give the trafficker less of a sentence because they view the victim as being complicit in the crime. Oh, it really wasn't such a bad crime because she really wanted to work in prostitution. She was his wife. They were doing it to make a better life for themselves. So educating judges and urging them to get educated about what trafficking looks like in its myriad forms is helpful. But I think we're sort of the least useful in terms of actually, I believe, because we just do our jobs once the cases get to us, and it doesn't look that different to me. But Taryn, you may have a different view.
I mean, I think that, raising awareness amongst the judges is important, so that when and if there is a trafficking trial, it's not a sort of shocking situation that the victim, might want to not testify under their full name. They might want to be anonymized. One of the questions was whether or not our trials are done in camera when it touches upon a trafficking situation. And in the United States, the answer is no. We have a very robust right of access to the courts, as interpreted by our higher courts. And, in order to help survivors feel secure in a public court proceeding where there might be members of the public, there might be members of the media present, we do often seek to anonymize their identities, and we tell the jury that it's so that they aren't, bothered by the media. We give neutral explanation. The judge will give a neutral explanation to the jury why the victims are being permitted to testify either by their initials or a nickname. And the thing that's really hard is for victims to corroborate one another. It's really hard to talk about each other if everything's anonymized. And so, we've developed some techniques for that using photographs. The person in photograph number 6, I saw her in this situation. Do you know the person in photograph number 4? I do. How do you know her? I met her in this place. We're going to call her, Jane 4 for this trial. Okay. You have to just develop these techniques, and it required some effort to get the judges to be on board with, some of these procedures that are inefficient, take extra time, and to really understand the importance of not re-traumatizing the victim through not only having them have to testify, but have to testify in the manner where they could then be written about in the media. And so, sensitizing the judges for the need for, how to handle the survivors is an important thing that the judiciary can help with, in my view.
Just one other question, if we have time, that was asked about the US. What particular types of trafficking are more prevalent in the US and why? And in New York City, no question, I think it's sex trafficking over labor trafficking. But that's partly because we don't have the typical industries that forced labor occurs in, for agriculture, factories, things like that. And sex trafficking, actually, when you think about it, there has to be some public interface, right? Because there's always a customer, whereas a lot of the labor stuff can go on in hidden environments, whether it's domestic help or inside a factory. So I think that's why at least we're able to detect it a little bit better, because there has to be some public interface, though it's still quite hidden in the ways it's conducted. But also New York City is unique. I think in the rest of the world, and Taryn might know the statistics better, or in the rest of the country, we obviously have a lot more forced labor. But yeah.
Okay,
I mean,
thank you.
There's
Sure.
forced labor everywhere, though. I mean, we've had some forced labor cases here in the United States as well, in New York, in the restaurant industry, and in
Nail salons.
some farms, and it's those industries are ripe for that type of victimization.
Okay, thank you so much, Judge Merkl and Chen, for being with us tonight. I know you were very busy schedule, but thank you so much for sharing your experiences and expertise in this field. And I know that today's session will be, a very educating one for our attendees. Before we move on to the closing poll, any concluding thought, any quick message that you would like to share with our attendees?
I think we've spoken probably enough, but all I can say is I believe you can sense how strongly, I think, and passionately Judge Merkl and I feel about how important and, quite frankly, rewarding it can be to work in this area and to really try to help and restore lives. I think it really, you have the laws, you just need to try to figure out how to make them work, even if you don't have all the resources you need.
I agree with that. And I also just want to thank you again for the invitation to spend this time with you. As Judge Chen mentioned, we do feel very passionately about it. So when given an opportunity to share some of our experience and encourage others to do this important work, I almost always say yes if my schedule allows. So thank you so much for this invitation and for spending this time with us. And thank you, Doctor, for your moderating.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Farhan.
Thank you so much. So I would like to ask our attendees to please stay on for a couple of more minutes, and you can see a survey link in the chat box, and you can also see that survey on your screen as well. So your response will really help us to improve our future events. So please take some time to fill out these survey questions. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us today. And I would also like to thank the US Embassy Pakistan and Pakistan US Alumni Network for arranging this wonderful session on this very important topic. And I hope that in future we will have such more sessions on this topic. Thank you so much.